Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Philip Goff. Philip is a philosopher and consciousness researcher at Durham University in the UK. His research focuses on how to integrate consciousness into our scientific worldview, and he's an advocate for Panpsychism, the view that consciousness is fundamental and widespread in the universe. He's the author of an academic book on the subject, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, and a book aimed at the general public, Galileos Era. Today we talk about the place of consciousness in our universe with a particular focus on Panpsychism. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, so I'm here with Philip Goff. Philip, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting.
Yeah, same. So forgive me for a bit of a route one approach to begin with, but I think it might be worth defining what you mean by consciousness before we delve into the kind of bigger questions around it, because obviously, different people mean different things when they say consciousness, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Philosophers always like to start with definitions. Yeah. Hopefully, we don't end with defining words. Start with defining words. And it is a bit of an ambiguous word. People use it in different ways, but I think I use it in a fairly standard way in the science and philosophy of consciousness, which is just to mean subjective experience. So your consciousness is what it's like to be you. So right now you're having an auditory experience of my voice, a visual experience of the room around you. If you pay attention, a tactile experience of the clothes on your body. So these are all aspects of what it's like to be you right now. And that's what we mean by your consciousness.
Right. So it doesn't necessarily mean linguistic thought and, self-reflection, self-awareness, all these complex things, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's actually a philosophical dispute. People might not be even aware of that as to whether those things are even forms of consciousness. I think still the dominant view in my tradition of philosophy, analytic philosophy, is that thought, strictly speaking, is nothing to do with consciousness, which has always seemed strange to me, and I think that consensus is shifting a bit. But at any rate, whether you think thought is or isn't a form of consciousness, it's not essential for consciousness. Yeah, we just mean any kind of experience, as long as there's something that it's like to be a given thing, we say that thing is conscious. So a rabbit, a hamster, they don't have language or reflexive thought, maybe, at least not of the kind of sophistication human beings have, but there's something that it's like to be a hamster. It feels pain, it experiences the world perceptually, so we say it has consciousness.
Right. I think it's interesting as well that you pointed to there that when people talk about consciousness, sometimes they'll shift from phenomenal experience through to something like self-awareness, self-recognition. And it's often almost those topics are spoken about as if they are equally mysterious and complex and hard to explain. But coming from a neuroscience background, to me, it really feels like self-recognition. You can imagine programming that into a robot that has no consciousness. It just can do visual processing and has a representation of itself. So it seems far more tractable. I mean, maybe this could take us into why phenomenal experience, consciousness, is a different kind of problem, right?
Yeah, and I mean, this is maybe what David Chalmers used to call the bait and switch move, where people start off saying they're going to explain consciousness, and it sounds like they mean, as you just said, the jargon is phenomenal consciousness, just in the sense of subjective experience. And then somewhere along the line, when you get to chapter 3 or 4 of the book, they slip to something that sounds a little bit like consciousness, something like the capacity of a system to monitor its internal states, or track information about the environment or something. And those things do seem much more tractable if you're just defining it behaviorally or functionally. Then we just need a kind of mechanism that can ensure the system performs that function. And we've explained it, but it looks like somewhere along the line we change definitions. And if we just mean consciousness in this sense of subjective experience, it's not so obvious, how, to say the least, how postulating a mechanism is going to explain that. It doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that invites mechanistic explanation.
Right. And would you say are you describing the same thing as the hard problem of consciousness there?
Yeah, I think so. There are different ways of putting it. The way I tend to introduce the problem is to focus on the qualities of our experience: colors, sounds, smells, tastes, these distinctive qualities we find when we attend to our experience, the redness of a red experience, the smell of coffee. And the way I tend to put the problem is to say that you can't capture those qualities in the purely quantitative language of physical science. And so if your description of the brain is framed in the purely quantitative language of neuroscience, you'll inevitably, I believe, miss out just leave out these qualities which are defining of waking conscious life. So that's the way there are different ways of coming at the problem, but that's what I tend to focus on, the clash between the qualities of consciousness and the purely quantitative language of physical science.
Right. And then you have there are a lot of people in science who feel that science has been so successful in explaining the physical world, right, that we can surely eventually it will encroach on consciousness. And, I think maybe Anil Seth might be a good example of someone who feels the march of science will eventually capture consciousness. This, I think, maybe leads us into, your book, your recent book was called Galileos Era, right? And I think your stance seems to be that in founding science, Galileo actually set it up so that we shouldn't really expect physical science to ever explain consciousness.
Yeah. So Anil Seth and I have had some pretty intense, but I think good-spirited and friendly discussions on this topic. But that's very much, what I was trying to tackle in Galileo's Era, because a lot of philosophy works with fiddly arguments, and I spend a lot of time as a professional philosopher on fiddly arguments. But at the end of the day, I kind of think they don't really convince anyone. They just work out what you have to say to be consistent in the view you already held. Whereas I think what motivates people are these kind of big picture considerations, like, wow, look how successful physical science has been. It's explained so much of our universe. Surely it's going to one day explain consciousness. I think that's what drives people to materialism. So what I present is an alternative way of looking at the history of science, which acknowledges its obviously its rightly celebrated success, but maybe points in a different direction. And that's just the observation that physical science has been so successful since, and arguably because, Galileo set things up by taking consciousness out of the domain of what he called natural philosophy, what we now call physical science, so that everything could be captured mathematically. And that's the start of mathematical physics. We sometimes forget there's a philosophy behind science, and that was largely dreamt up by one of the greatest philosophers ever lived, Galileo. And so the fact that physical science has done so well since Galileo took consciousness out shouldn't really give us reason to think it's going to be able to fully deal with consciousness itself. And again, it's back to this qualities, quantities thing, because Galileo wanted science to be purely mathematical. I think he appreciated you can't capture these qualities, colors, sounds, smells, tastes in that kind of language. So he thought, right, well, if we want science to be mathematical, we have to put that out of the picture, put that in the soul, so that the rest of the physical world can be completely described mathematically. That went really well. And now we're in a period of history where people are like, oh, it's gone so well, that must be everything. But it's gone so well because we took consciousness out. And I think if we want to bring consciousness fully back into science, we have to find a way to bring back together what Galileo separated. That's the kind of...
Right. And was Galileo's philosophical move to go from thinking, if you eat an apple and it tastes sweet, I guess before Galileo did people think that the quality of sweetness was in the apple, and if they'd known about the molecules, that it was in the sucrose or fructose, and then moving it to say, well, actually, no, the feeling of sweetness is in the soul, consciousness, whatever word you want to use.
Yeah, right. So that's the broader story here, that before Galileo, I think people assumed these qualities were not in consciousness, but out there in the physical world, right? They were on the surfaces of objects, the smells floating through the air, as you say, tastes inside food. But then what Galileo does is strip the world of those qualities and proposed this radically new philosophical theory of reality, where they're not really out there in the world, they're in the consciousness of the observer. So the redness of the apple and its fruity taste aren't really in the apple, they're in the consciousness of the person eating. You can see, like before Galileo, this is why people didn't think you could completely capture the physical world in mathematics, because it was full of these qualities. It was only once they'd been taken out of the picture that we could describe the physical world exhaustively in mathematical terms. So he took them out, but then of course now we want a science of consciousness, and so the qualities come back to bite us, and we can't make that move again.
Right. And so you have this split between the kind of quantitative and the qualitative. What's your general approach to trying to bring these back together again in a new science of consciousness?
So I think we need a new philosophical worldview as the backdrop for science. We need a worldview that brings the qualities back into the unified scientific story. And my proposal for doing that is a view known as Panpsychism. Should I talk a little bit about that?
Definitely, yeah.
Well, I mean, by the definition of the term, Panpsychism is the view that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical world. So on one standard understanding of panpsychism, the fundamental building blocks of reality, perhaps fundamental particles like electrons and quarks, have incredibly simple forms of experience, and then the very complex experience of the human or brain is somehow built up, is somehow rooted in or derived from the very simple consciousness at the level of fundamental physics. That's an introduction to the picture. There's lots of ways in which in contemporary philosophy it's been filled out, but by putting consciousness and its qualities in at the level of fundamental physics, we find a way of joining what Galileo separated, bringing qualitative consciousness back into the scientific story of the physical world.
Right, and so it's not a return to the kind of naive realism that people had before Galileo, where they think that the sweet quality is inside the apple, right? But you're still saying that when you have those perceptual experiences, it's your consciousness, it's happening in the consciousness of the individual, but so it's a different stance, right, to the stance that existed before Galileo.
Well, some people do make that move, actually. Some people share my concern about Galileo taking the qualities out, and they choose to put them back in the physical world out there, actually. So there's just been a special issue of the Journal of Consciousness Studies, which was 19 essays responding to my book Galileos Era by philosophers and scientists and theologians. And two of the contributors, two of the philosophers, my co-editor Alex Moran and Michelle Liu, they propose that the qualities really are out there in the world. And I mean, Alex Moran says, well, you've dealt with one set of qualities, those in the mind, but what about these ones out there in the world? So some philosophers do defend that, but that's not an attractive move for me. Maybe we could talk about that, I don't know. But yes, for me, I mean, I'm happy to say my book had a provocative title. You know, I think this was probably a good move by Galileo. I agree with him that the qualities aren't out there in the physical world, they're in the mind. But the qualities in the mind are then reducible to more simple qualities at the level of fundamental physics. So whereas Galileo, in a sense, put them outside of the physical world, or at least the physical world as it is dealt with by physical science, I'm putting them back in the core of the physical world. That's the approach.
Right. And so it seems this approach is it could be contrasted with an emergent approach where there's no consciousness in fundamental physics, and then systems like ourselves come into existence, then consciousness comes along with us, or systems similar to ourselves. But perhaps you could explain the rationale as to why you might want to argue consciousness is fundamental and that we kind of inherit, or, you know, our consciousness is somehow grounded in the kind of fundamental layer of reality.
Yeah, good. So that would be a rival, the main competitor, I suppose, a sort of emergentist materialist view. I guess my reason for rejecting that is something I've already touched upon, this idea that the problem is that physical science can't capture these qualities we find in our experience. So maybe just to spell that argument out a little bit more. So the first move is to say, as I've said a couple of times now, that physical science can't fully describe those qualities. It can capture a lot about their mathematical structure, color experience has different dimensions of hue, saturation, brightness, and we can map out a color space along those three dimensions. We could capture all that in a kind of mathematical framework. But I don't think that kind of mathematical structure would fully pin down the redness of a red experience. And the way to see that is using that kind of language you couldn't convey to a blind neuroscientist what it's like to see red, the redness of red experience. Now, of course, that's because of something to do with their brain. That's fine. All I'm saying in the first instance is that the language of neuroscience can't capture those qualities fully. That's a descriptive limitation of that kind of vocabulary. So that's the first move. And the inference, but I think what we can infer from that, and this is sort of the second move of the argument, is a kind of explanatory limitation to neuroscience. Because if you wanted, in neuroscientific terms, or in terms of physical science more generally, if you wanted to reductively explain the qualities of our experience, I think you'd have to be able to characterize them. If I got my brilliant neuroscientific theory, which was supposed to explain why red experiences have this reddish quality, that particular quality, I think my theory would first have to fully articulate that quality and then show how it can be analyzed in more fundamental physical terms, patterns of neural firings or whatever. If the theory can't even define the phenomenon, then I think it can't reductively explain it. So that would be the full argument. So essentially, I don't think you can get consciousness out of physical science. And if you think of physical science as bottoming out in physics, I don't think you can get consciousness out of physics. What I think is dead easy is doing it the other way around. I think it's very easy to get physics out of consciousness. Sounds strange. How do you get physics out of consciousness? Why would that be easy? Because since Galileo, again, physics has offered us a purely mathematical description of the physical world at the fundamental level, right? The maths has changed a lot since Galileo. It's non-Euclidean geometry and wacky things like imaginary numbers, but it's purely mathematical. So a couple of ways you can react to that. You can think, well, maybe reality at base is purely mathematical. If that's all there is in physics, maybe at the fundamental level, we are living in a mathematical universe, as the physicist Max Tegmark wants to say. But an alternative response to this fact that physics is purely mathematical is to say, well, maybe there's something underlying the mathematical structures physics identifies. Maybe there's something that those mathematical structures are the structures of. So this is the approach of the panpsychist. So essentially the view is, at the fundamental level, we've got incredibly simple conscious entities that behave in very simple, predictable ways because they have very simple kinds of experience. Through their interactions, they realize certain mathematical structures. And then the idea is those mathematical structures are the mathematical structures physics identifies. So those conscious entities are what physics is talking about. So it doesn't know it's talking about conscious entities because it's as a physicist, you're just interested in the mathematical structure. You're not interested in what, if anything, underlies that structure. But the idea is, in some sense, physics is talking about these simple conscious entities. When we think about those conscious entities in terms of the mathematical structures they realize, we call them particles, we call them fields, we call their properties mass, spin, and charge. But really all there is at the fundamental level is forms of consciousness. So in that way, we can get physics, I believe, out of consciousness, but we can't do it the other way around. So it's a sort of, I mean, you said the word emergence. I think you've got a choice. Do you think the two stories of emergence here? Does consciousness emerge from physics, or does physics emerge from consciousness? I think the former story. Did I get that the right way around? I don't think you can. I don't think we can make sense of consciousness emerging from physics because of the qualities, quantity stuff. I do think it's not only we can make sense of, it's just very easy to make sense of how physics could emerge from consciousness, because physics is just, in a sense, so thin. It's just pure mathematics. As long as you've got stuff realizing that mathematics, you can get physics out of a more fundamental story.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a hugely important point, that science really is a map. You know, we come up with mathematical descriptions of the territory of existence, but the map and the territory are not the same thing. You know, all of our best descriptions of fundamental physics are in how things behave. They don't really tell us what the things are in and of themselves, right? And so that you can say, well, maybe the things are forms of consciousness. I have a more kind of, I guess, like a Kantian approach, where I think it's a kind of unknowable, numinous, who knows what it really is, you know. But I think realizing this is very important, right? That I think most people assume physicists are really dealing with, they're in direct contact with the thing in itself of, you know, the particles. They're not just observing behavior and mapping it. And is this approach that you're describing, is it largely aligned with Bertrand Russell's approach?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, as you say, yeah, I mean, I used to put this, and I put it in the book Galileos Era, just the way you put it now, in terms of more physics just tells us what stuff does. Physics talks about mass, charge, and these properties are just defined in terms of behavior, things like attraction, repulsion, resistance, acceleration. More recently, I've started focusing on the mathematical nature of physics. I've felt that is more accessible, more easy for people to get a grip on. It's essentially the same point, though. And as you've also rightly said, that, you know, both approaches really are rooted in very important work of Bertrand Russell from the 1920s in a book called The Analysis of Matter, where, I mean, he pointed out how thin the description we get in physics is, in a certain sense. He said physics is mathematical, not because it tells us so much, but because it tells us so little. He said it gives us is the causal skeleton of the world, and not the sort of flesh and bones. Stephen Hawking much later said physics doesn't tell us what breathes fire into the equations. Another way of making the same point. But, you know, and this was sort of tragically forgotten about for so long, even though Russell is such a famous and influential philosopher. I think people tend to remember him for his more logical linguistic work, his pacifism. But this kind of stuff was sort of, I mean, it was not totally forgotten about, but it wasn't really, I would never learn to at university. But then just the last 10 or 15 years, it's once again come to the fore, and people are seeing it as a really attractive approach to consciousness that maybe avoids difficulties of the more traditional options. And it sort of turns the problem on its head. You know, you typically think, we know what matter is, the mysterious thing is consciousness, where he said, no, actually, we know what consciousness is. You know what consciousness is because you're immediately aware of your own consciousness. It's matter we don't understand. So we sort of build up our picture of matter around our understanding of consciousness. And Arthur Eddington, the scientist, later developed this. But also what you said there, just picking on another thing you said, yeah, another approach is a sort of epistemological humility, as you say, a Kantian view, to say, we just don't know what's down there. We just, in reviewing my academic book, the philosopher Daniel Stoljar, I reviewed it for Notre Dame Philosophical Reviews, which is probably the big place that academic philosophy books are reviewed, the main respected source. He said that point as well. He thought, rather than being bold enough to say panpsychism is true, we should say we just don't know what the hell's down there. So another approach to have the similar kind of Russell view, if you don't want to go panpsychist, is to say, well, there's some stuff down there, and given that we don't know the nature of that stuff, it's not a surprise that we don't know how consciousness arises, because we don't know the nature of matter. So it's not a surprise that we don't know how it makes consciousness. We don't really know anything about it. So I, I've got a lot of time and respect for that view. I suppose my approach is, why go that route when you could tell a more fuller, less mysterious, if you like, story. There's the potential to tell a fuller story, or you can press panpsychism with a sort of simplicity argument. The only thing we know about the nature of matter is that some of it, i.e. the stuff in brains, has this consciousness involving nature. That's the only, as Russell said, it's the only window we have onto the real nature of matter, because we're immediately aware of the nature of the matter in our brains. So that's our starting point, and we're speculating to some extent about the stuff outside of our brains, its nature. The most simple, parsimonious hypothesis is that the stuff outside of brains is continuous with the stuff inside of brains, in also having a consciousness involving nature. So, I've got an article in Eon magazine, a very short article, making this point that, people think panpsychism is kind of extravagant, but I think it's the most parsimonious theory of reality, given that the only thing we know about the nature of matter is that some of it is conscious.
Right. And I guess in trying to get rid of a dualism where you don't know how, matter and mind relate, it feels almost like in this view, consciousness becomes matter in a sense. It's the nature of matter is consciousness. So is it fair to say that almost consciousness is the substance of existence in this view?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way of putting it. Consciousness is the ultimate nature of matter. So it's very common misunderstanding to interpret panpsychism dualistically, that the idea is, that the particles have their physical properties like mass, spin, and charge, and also these weird consciousness properties. And the physicist Sabine Hossenfelder had a blog post attacking panpsychism, and she was interpreting it in this dualistic way and saying, if there were these funny consciousness properties, they'd show up in our physics. But that's not the view. The view is that there's just physical stuff, just physical properties, just the kind of properties the standard model of particle physics talks about: mass, spin, charge. It's just that those properties, mass, spin, and charge, are forms of consciousness. Consciousness is the ultimate and only nature of matter. And that seems very weird at first, but it feels very weird because we think we know what matter is. We think we have this substantive picture of what matter is. But once you appreciate all physical science tells us is what stuff does, its kind of abstract causal structure, it doesn't really tell us what it is. And there's a sort of, thereby a kind of hole in our scientific story of the universe. Then there's the theoretical option of slipping consciousness in that hole. But yeah, you're right. It's in some ways very close to dualism. There's a nice line David Chalmers saying it's sort of the letter of materialism, but the spirit of anti-materialism. I think that's, it's taking consciousness in the way the dualist does, as a concrete, irreducible feature of reality. But instead of putting it separate to matter, it's building matter up out of that.
Right. And it sounds, in this particular articulation of it, quite similar to idealism to me, the idea that the only thing that really exists is consciousness.
Yeah, so we get to tricky terminological issues about how we define idealism. I tend to think of idealism as a view that there's something more fundamental than the physical world. Maybe the physical world doesn't exist, or at least it's a construction out of a more fundamental reality underlying it. So George Berkeley, the classic 18th century. Was he 18th century or 19th century? God, that's embarrassing. I should know. I think he's 18th century, wasn't he? Yeah, so he thought the physical world exists, tables and chairs exist, but they are collections of ideas. So at the fundamental level of reality, we just have souls with certain ideas, our souls, God's soul, and the physical world arises as constructions of the kind of ideas we have. Whereas I think the panpsychist view is closer to the materialist in saying that the physical world is real and it's fundamental. And in a sense, physics gets it completely right. At least physics maps out its causal structure perfectly. And that's the fundamental story of reality. It's just that the physical world is filled out with this consciousness nature, this underlying mental nature. So if you define idealism in that way, then panpsychism is different to idealism. But if you just define idealism as fundamental level of reality is entirely mental, then it would be a form of idealism. Some panpsychists think the fundamental level of reality is mental and maybe has some non-mental nature as well. So I suppose that's an option. You can have a pure panpsychist where the fundamental nature of the physical world is purely mental. Also a sort of impure panpsychist where there's a non-mental aspect. So in that sense, idealism and panpsychism might perhaps overlap. But anyway, these are tricky terminological issues.
And so there are also different kinds of panpsychism, right? Like a question that comes to mind is, in the view you've been describing, you've got all these kind of fundamental particles that have conscious experience and are forms of consciousness. But I could also imagine a view where there's a single consciousness that makes up reality. And I've seen you write about kind of micro-psychism and cosmo-psychism. Do they map onto these different stances?
Yeah, I would say there are two different forms of panpsychism. So depending on what we're taking to be the fundamental building blocks of reality. So standardly, it's set up in a sort of particle ontology, where reality is made up of micro level particles, and so they would be the things that have the fundamental forms of consciousness. But actually, many theoretical physicists prefer to think that the fundamental constituents of reality are not particles but universe-wide fields, and then particles are just sort of local excitations in those fields. So if you combine that with panpsychism, you get the view that the fundamental forms of consciousness are the ultimate nature of these universe-wide fields, and we get a kind of, as you say, cosmopsychist view that the fundamental conscious entity is the universe itself. I always want to add that that it sounds like that's God or something, but we don't need to think of the universe as being intelligent or an agent. You might think you only have those kind of characteristics if you've the result of millions of years of evolution. You might just think the universe its consciousness is just a kind of meaningless mess. But yeah, that's actually a view I'm much more. I defended in my kind of academic book, and then I've kind of come back to for various reasons. I think is perhaps a more attractive form of panpsychism than the bottom-up particle view.
Has your position changed over time?
Oh, a lot, yeah. I change my mind all the time. And some people have criticised me for that. I thought I should have thought about it more before I put pen to paper. But look, I think it's early days, and I think science and philosophy benefit when people get ideas out there and explore them, and get them torn apart. Or so yeah, I think I'm coming back to a cosmopsychist view. Worries about how you get the structure of our consciousness out of structure at the level of fundamental physics. So I worry that if my consciousness was just formed from the consciousness of the particles making up my brain, it's hard to see how the spatial, this is maybe getting a bit sort of technical, but it's hard to see how the spatial relationships between the particles would play any role in in shaping my experience. If I'm just sort of hoovering up, as it were, the consciousness of each individual particle, then you just have like an aggregate of trillions of pinpricks of consciousness. And what role do the spatial relationships make? Whereas if you start with a field, and if you're thinking about like the field in my brain as filled out by experience, then that's going to have experience corresponding to spatial relationships. So that's basically why I'm thinking more in line with the cosmopsychist picture, because it helps us make sense of how the spatial relationships get to be experiential. And I mean, just why does that matter? Because it's just totally obvious empirically that, you know, my consciousness corresponds in some way to the structure of my brain, to sort of high level information structures, on whichever view ends up being correct, you know, in terms of the neural correlates of consciousness. And the structure of my brain is dependent on the spatial relationships, right? So we obviously need to find some way in which spatial relationships play a role in shaping my phenomenology. And so maybe that's beyond the cosmopsychist. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think often when people are pushing back against panpsychism, they'll point out that if it may solve the hard problem, but then it creates a potentially equally hard problem with the combination problem, right? If you have these different subatomic particles with their own consciousness, how do they come together and produce a single consciousness? Do you feel like the cosmopsychism view makes it easier to account for to solve the combination problem?
So I think the combination problem has many aspects. What I've just been talking about is to do with the question of structure. How do we get the structure of our minds out of the structure at the level of fundamental physics? So in general, the combination problem is just a demand to explain the relationship between our consciousness, biological consciousness, and consciousness at the level of fundamental physics. For the panpsychist, our consciousness is somehow rooted in or derived from consciousness at the level of fundamental physics. If we can't account for our consciousness, then it's kind of game over. That's ultimately what we want to do. So one aspect of that challenge of how you get our conscious, so I think it's really easy to get physics out of consciousness. That's not the hard thing for the panpsychist. The hard thing is how you get our consciousness out of consciousness at the level of physics. One challenge of that is a question of structure. How do we get consciousness with the structure of our minds out of consciousness at the level of fundamental physics? That's what I've sort of been talking about and thinking might work better in a field ontology rather than a particle ontology. But a more basic worry is just why on earth would there be even any consciousness above the level of physics? So if you're thinking in terms of conscious particles, I mean, this is what William James wrestled with in the 19th century. He was really attracted to panpsychism, but he thought, you get a load of conscious particles, stick them together, you just have conscious particles. Why would it suddenly pop up consciousness corresponding to the group as a whole? So this is a really serious challenge, and the main focus of the contemporary panpsychist research program. Lots of very interesting proposals. What I've been thinking about recently, actually, is something I rejected for a long time that people have been pressing for a while, like Greg Miller and Barry Dainton. But I've just been thinking more about recently is appealing to the co-consciousness relation. So this is proposed sometimes to account for the unity of consciousness. So, any given moment, one's experience comprises a plurality of many different experiences. The sound of my voice, the colors in the room around you, the feel of heat. There's many different experiences, and they're not sort of just sitting in isolation from one another. Rather, you have a single unified experience that comprises, that involves all of these different sub-experiences, we might call them, the experiences that are parts of your overall experience. So this is called the unity of consciousness, the fact that your consciousness at any moment comes in this deeply unified form. And there are different ways of analyzing that. One way of analyzing it is appealing to this co-consciousness relation. So maybe say what is going on is the different sub-experiences are all standing in the co-consciousness relation, the relationship of being experienced together. And we just take that to be a sort of fundamental relationship. And that's why I have a unified conscious experience. So if that's the correct analysis, which it might not be, then we could start to make sense of, well, maybe my experiences and your experiences could come to stand in the co-consciousness relation, and we'd cease to be distinct minds, but would become one unified ubermind. We'd start to make sense of mental combination. So maybe that's what's, if that all makes sense, if we can make sense of mental combination that way, then the panpsychists can say, that's what brings together the many different particle minds to make a biological mind. These many different experiences come to stand in the co-consciousness relation, and thereby form a composite mind. So I mean, I think there's an equivalent way of spelling that out in the cosmopsychist view. So yeah, so that's the approach I've been thinking about at the moment. But yeah, it's a very serious challenge, and it's all very well saying you've solved the hard problem, but if you can't address that, but there's one proposal and there are others, so I think it seems to me a more tractable challenge.
Right. And so you have our rich, human consciousness, and I've heard you say that the kinds of consciousness you're talking about, the level of fundamental particles, would be, I think you've used the phrase, incredibly simple forms of consciousness. And I struggle to feel what that would mean in terms of, what's the continuum we're talking about here from our consciousness. I understand that you want to reassure people that you're not talking about particles kind of having ennui and thinking about their existence and all this kind of verbal kind of stuff going on. And but what does it mean to you to say that it's a simple form of consciousness?
So you're right. I mean, it's important to stress that we're not talking about human consciousness when we're saying that particles have consciousness. Human consciousness is incredibly rich and sophisticated, result of millions of years of evolution. But consciousness comes in all shapes and sizes, and I guess the idea is that there's a very general concept of subjective experience in the background here. Like you can have a very general concept of shape, and then there's many different kinds of shape. I think there's a very general concept of experience that can exist in very, very complex forms, simpler forms, horses, sheep, hamsters, bed bugs, and there seems no natural limit to that. Such that it seems logically coherent that subjective experience could exist in incredibly simple forms. I suppose that if the question is, well, what's it like to be a quark? What's it like to be a particle? What's it like to be a field? I mean, I'm not sure we could ever totally come to understand that in the way we, as the philosopher Thomas Nagel famously pointed out, I don't think we'll ever know what it's like to be a bat. Because to fully understand the consciousness of an organism, you have to be able to adopt its perspective, and we can't fully adopt the perspective of a creature that echolocates its way around the world, just as a blind person can't adopt the perspective of someone who sees colors. So I'm not sure we'll ever totally understand what it's like to be a particle, but I suppose the panpsychist view would be that its experience has a structure that mirrors its physical structure. And then if we can get some kind of theory that explains in a fully intelligible way how experience with the structure of the human mind arises from simpler forms of experience with the structure of fundamental physics, then I think that will be, huge theoretical progress, even if we can't fully fill out the details, because consciousness is not a publicly observable phenomenon. You have to be able to adopt the perspective of the conscious thing, and we just can't do that. I mean, I don't want to rule anything out. Maybe in the future we can fiddle with our brains to work out what it's like to be a bat, maybe work out what it's like to be a particle. I don't know. Maybe there'll be theoretical innovations that can bridge that gap, but it's not obvious.
Right. And you mentioned earlier that we don't need to think of, if the cosmopsychism picture is correct, and reality consists of a single mind, that we don't need to think of that mind as God or anything like that. And the view that you're putting forward seems very kind of secular and scientific, and it doesn't involve any kind of, crazy reconfiguring of our understanding of the nature of reality. It's a kind of, philosophical shift in perspective. But I do, it does seem appealing to people because it does seem to maybe fit more neatly with certain kind of spiritual beliefs compared to the kind of materialistic view. Like my instinct is that in this picture, when we die, I can imagine there almost being, a kind of, if we are the coming together of these conscious particles, and then those conscious particles return, they still exist after this body dies, right? And they go off and continue their conscious existence. To me, it seems to promise something in the form of eternal life after death. So if you identify with that consciousness of existence, well, yeah. What's your take on that?
It's interesting. So I always want to emphasize that, as you say, panpsychism is not necessarily wrapped up in anything spiritual. It's many of the contemporary philosophers defending it, like Luke Roloff's one really great panpsychist philosopher, David Chalmers, that are just total atheist secularists. They don't believe in any transcendent reality. They just believe in pain, pleasure, seeing color, and think that there's good reason to think that resists conventional scientific explanation. But as you also hinted at, I think if for independent reasons one does have certain spiritual convictions, I think a panpsychist worldview is perhaps more consonant with such convictions. If you say you have a mystical experience, and it seems to you in this mystical experience that there's this higher form of consciousness, root of all things, and if you're a materialist, you've just got to think that's some kind of delusion. But if you're a panpsychist and you already think there's consciousness at the level of fundamental physics, it's not too much of a leap to think that what you seem to be apprehending in the mystical experience, this higher form of consciousness, is part of that story that's going on at the fundamental level of reality. I mean, you needn't think that. There's difficult questions about, is it rationally permissible to trust mystical experiences? And you might still think, no, I don't think it's rational. It's just something funny going on in my brain. But it's less of it's at least a view that's more consistent with your worldview. But life after death, I don't know. I'm not sure. I do in the final chapter of my book, Galileos Era, is the more experimental chapter, where I'm just wildly speculating, and I do explore the possibility of a sort of impersonal life after death, which one could perhaps a panpsychist could make sense of if they took mystical experiences seriously, mystical experiences of a certain form. So some people in different cultures and different times claim to have these experiences that render apparent to them that there is this universal element at the core of each conscious mind, sometimes called universal consciousness. So on this kind of view, your mind and my mind aren't really totally distinct, that there is this element, universal consciousness at their core, and the rest of the conscious mind is sort of built around those foundations. So if you took that kind of mystical conception of reality seriously, maybe because you have had a mystical experience, or maybe you trust the testimony of people who've had mystical experiences. Philosopher Miriam Bahari argues that we should treat experienced meditators as expert testimony, what they say, the expert testimony. So if you did take that kind of view seriously, that might make sense of a kind of impersonal survival after death. That maybe even though when I die most of my conscious mind passes out of existence, but maybe this universal consciousness at the core remains in existence. So, I mean, this is reminiscent of many of some interpretations of Buddhism, some forms of Advaita Vedanta Hinduism. But, I mean, in these traditions, the thought was you have to, the aim is to achieve enlightenment by meditating and getting rid of all the bad karma. But maybe if there's no rebirth, all the bad stuff is stripped away anyway when you die. If there really is this universal element at the core of our consciousness, and there's no rebirth, so everything else kind of dies, maybe we all get enlightened when we die. Anyway, I want all that I've just said to be understood as, not something I believe or, just wild speculation. But if some panpsychists who'd also take mystic experiences seriously, that avenue might be opened up. As for kind of personal survival after death, or you mentioned your atoms carrying on, I'm not sure whether that is any more heartwarming than the usual materialist story of our atoms going on. Okay, they've got some very simple form of consciousness, but it's not my consciousness. My consciousness is what is informed by my memory and my personality and my life history. And I mean, if that goes, then it's not much consolation, I don't think, if my particles are still have some kind of very crude awareness. Although I do worry actually about maybe, when I die, if maybe my brain is still conscious in some way, there's some kind of memories floating. I want to be cremated actually for this reason. I'm a little bit worried. We don't understand the neural correlates of consciousness. So maybe there could be some kind of consciousness in a dead brain. Maybe it's some kind of dream-like state and getting more and more messed up as your brain rots away. I do kind of worry about that.
Yeah. Some kind of locked-in experience after death.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I'm not saying I, think there's any reason to take that seriously, but I think we're still pretty clueless on the neural correlates of consciousness. So I don't think we can be, and what we have to work off is, because consciousness is not publicly observable, we have to work off asking living, awake people while we scan their brains. And so I think we can make great progress in that way, but there's always going to be some limitations when it gets to animals, organisms more distant from ourselves, or dead people. You can't ask a dead person if they're conscious. I do give some credence to the possibility that there's something that it's like to be a corpse.
Right. I mean, you mentioned earlier kind of you're worried it was too technical. You're trying to explain the kind of why the spatial relationships of atoms in the brain would be relevant for our consciousness. But I think this is a perfect example of that, because the implication is, when you mention cremation, which I completely share, is that if there was any chance of that completely destroying the structure of the brain through cremation would be our best bet as to eradicate that consciousness. So we both, even though we don't have a fully formed neuroscientific theory of consciousness, we both have a very strong intuition that structure is highly relevant there, right?
Yeah, or at least it would get rid of my memories, I think. I think it would. Yeah, so I'm not totally sure. It would. I probably agree with you. You would cease to have a conscious thing there. But even if there was some kind of diffuse consciousness in the plumes of smoke leaving the crematorium, I don't think that, you need, assuming my memories have been, which not everyone accepts. I had a long conversation with Rupert Sheldrake at a philosophy festival recently. Not everyone accepts memories are stored in the brain, but I guess I have that working assumption. And, if the brain's totally burnt, you're gonna, I didn't expect the conversation to go this way. Actually, it was interesting.
Yeah. I hope this isn't a morbid point to end on. Yeah, but yeah, this has been really fun. Thank you so much. Where would you send people to if they want to look into your work more?
My website is philipgoffphilosophy.com. Is it philosophy, Philip Goff? philipgoffphilosophy.com. I had half a glass of wine, so spent too much time arguing on Twitter. Philip_Goff. That's Philip with one L and Goff, Goff. And I've got a blog. I have my own podcast, Mind Chat, which
Right.
I run with someone with the polar opposite philosophical view to me, someone who thinks consciousness doesn't even exist. It's an illusion, a trick the brain plays on us. So the gimmick is I think consciousness is everywhere. He thinks it's nowhere. So yeah, that's about the basics.
Great. I'll put those links in the description. Yeah, and thank you again.
Oh, thank you very much. It's been a really fun conversation. Thank you.